Okay, you guys can read this. So it makes sense. But it's going to tap into what we are going to talk about today. Why is that the right answer?
The end of the day.
Well, yes, that's correct. Go ahead.
Because the East Indian Company kind of controlled India before that, and the revolt was mismanagement on their part in really bloody, so the English had to kind of take control.
It's a very good guess, not the right answer, but very good guess. So here, we're talking about mercantilism, okay? And if you remember, the mother country, okay? So mercantilism, the mother country, mom, right? So the mom and the little children, which are the colonies. Now, if you remember, the very first approach to colonization was not based off of mercantilism. It really was based off of this exploration and thinking of, it's much more of a feudal system. The Spanish, for example, when the Spanish were out to try to get lands, they were doing so because land meant wealth. In Europe, if you got land, then you could have build your castle and people would come to you. You'd have peasants coming to you because you would be protecting them. It's not a money exchange. If you got the land, that means that you were a vassal of somebody else who had a whole bunch of land. You could give out sections of land to people. They would build their castle. The peasants would basically work the land for them. They'd spend all their time being a knight and polishing their swords and really being able to fight. And if you remember, Columbus is 1492. It kind of galls me sometimes when we hold Columbus up to a standard for like 1900 or post-Enlightenment. 1492. This is Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, land is wealth. And so that's how the Spanish looked at this. You go explore, you get this land. And what do we do? Well, we give it to the people who explored it. They become the lords of that little area. They create a castle, and naturally, all the peasants will come in and help work the land. Naturally, because that's exactly what they've been doing in Europe for the last 1,000 years. They had no other reference to it. Mercantilism changes this. Mercantilism is not land equals wealth, profit equals wealth. And we look at this as almost like, well, it's obvious, but it's not. It's obvious today because we live in a commercial society, not just the United States, the world now is. And it is now because of the shift from this feudal into mercantilism, where basically you need to make sure that more gold comes in than goes out. This is not looking right, but how about that? Okay. More gold in than goes out. In a plain language, that means if you're a business owner, you start up a bakery, you should be getting more sales money coming in than you're spending on the ingredients. That's a profit. But not just for individuals like me as a baker. This is a national policy. Now, you guys know, I don't want to get too deep here, but this is not news for you. This can only be a policy if we have modern nation states. Because then we're actually thinking about states and offices and treasuries. During the feudalism, you don't have modern nation states. We don't care about treasuries. We're not having to pay for a standing army. Does this make sense? We talked about this when we were going into the constitutionalism. One of the reasons why the English erupted in their civil war was that James I says, I'm an absolute monarch. I want your taxes. Give me the money because then I'm going to go off on this war and do great things for England. Well, he was fairly successful at it. Brother Charles comes in, asks for the same things. The nobles are saying, we keep giving you this money. You are failing. And so he said, well, we'll bring you all together, this big parliament. We bring you all together. Give me the money. The parliament says, I'll give you the money if you respect these rights. Petition of Rights, 1621. And Charles said, sure, I'll respect the rights. He gets the money. As soon as he gets the money, he dissolves the parliament. Says, I'm not listening to you anymore. This triggers the English Civil War. He loses his head over this. Cromwell has a revolutionary government for, 10, 12 years. And And when Charles II comes back in, he comes in there promising to respect rights. This lasts for a little while, he dies, James II comes back, and he goes back saying, no, absolute monarch, I don't need to listen to you, you have to listen to me, because I am kind of ordained to be your leader here. And it didn't go well. This is when John Locke writes his second treatise on second government. There's all sorts of Enlightenment thinkers on this. John Locke is the most important one. He's the one that says, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, happiness. This concept of constitutionalism is based on the idea that a state has responsibility to the people that are in it. You cannot have this sense of rights without first having this sense of a state. And once you have this sense of rights, this is triggered by the fact that we have treasuries, people being asked to give money. It's a shift already in mercantilism. What happens is that instead of just thinking about taxes, we also are thinking about larger policies. Mercantilism begins late 1600s. The Dutch really are the first to do this. The French do this. English kind of dabble with it. By 1700, English is really good at this mercantile policy. Well, why would England be good at this? Why would the Dutch be good at this? More so than France. France dabbled, didn't do so well. I'll just give you a picture here. Here's France. Here's England. Why is England just naturally suited for this mercantile policy? Right, Jason.
It's an island, so naval trade.
They're totally. I mean, even with France, right? They're in ships all the time. France doesn't have to. France dabbles with it because they're beginning to really dabble in this modern nation state. Louis XIII is trying to imitate James I and being this absolute monarch. Louis XIV, which you guys have all heard, the Sun King, he's resuming this absolute standard for leadership. He's doing this in the 1700s, early 1700s. James I was 100 years earlier. England went through this constitutionalism, and what you could say is that they kind of vented the pressure. France is late. So what's going to happen at the end of the 1700s? I don't know, 1789 or so? They didn't vent with constitutionalism. In other words, there's a great deal of pressure. The people are being asked to do taxes. They're being unable to give any voice to this modern nation state, and yet they feel like their rights are being violated, and nothing is being addressed. And so what's the natural reaction? Well, they have a revolution. Now, they don't just have one revolution. They have two, I talked about. The nobles are the first. The peasants are the first to overthrow the king. Later, when the kids get involved, the students, that's when you're going to have the second revolution. Just saw Les Miserables last night. That's kind of plot line. We'll throw that aside. Okay. Mercantilism, once it's mature, and it is absolutely mature by the 1750s, okay? By 1800, even more so. The mother country needs to bring in cheap goods. And so we have not colonies for the sake of just having land. We don't claim all of South America. It's not useful. We want trade. So what you're really developing are ports. That's a sophisticated mercantile policy. The Dutch have been doing this from the beginning, partially because the Dutch really are not a major military powerhouse. They don't have a very strong nation state. They're kind of fragmented, but they're really good with business. They've got banks, they've got money, they're big on business, and so they also start ports. You can have some islands that have two different ports, two different countries. But the goal of mercantilism is that you buy the raw materials. You're trading. It's a trade system. You bring them back home. The mommy finishes it up, and then you sell it. You sell it to everybody else, but you also sell it back to the colony. And this is a finished product. When you do that, you get a profit. Make sense? So then we go over to this question. East India Company is a company that's establishing English ports all over the world. There's lots of companies. East India is referring to which India? East India. West India is referring to which India? The West Indies, the Caribbean, right? Okay, so this, I talked about this a little bit. Indian. It doesn't refer yet to the country that we think of as India, because India as a country doesn't exist. We'll talk about this tomorrow, but India is basically hundreds of these local, you might call them warlords, right? It's not feudalism, but there is no united India. There's no united India, so there's no India. So we call them the Indies, right? And the Indies, off in India, the Indies is no like country we're referring to. So East Indies, East India Company. West Indies, Caribbean. This is a company. They set up a port. They set up ports in India. They set up ports in Africa. They set up ports in, not so much in Africa because Portugal kind of owns that, but they do have some. They set up ports in Malaysia, in China. These are just ports. And the goal is simply to trade. Now, okay, spice trade is certainly contributing to the creation of these companies, but it's just a demand. It's not a cause. Ram Mohan Roy we'll talk about in a second. The Indian Revolt is important because what does that do to the port? It threatens them. Does that make sense? All you want is a port. And if you're successful, all you need is a port. The United States is a funny example that taught England, and a lot of people a lot, the American colonies. The American colonies were formed back when England was still thinking of land as some type of wealth. This is 1606. I mean, it's early. And England is not a strong country at this point. I mean, it's not weak, but it is by no means like the strongest country. France has fur traders up to the north. That's where they're trading. They're in Canada. Spain has like a total monopoly on Central and South America. And there's no way that the English can really get into that. So what's left? This scrub brush in the middle. And truly, from the English perspective, the Americans, the least valuable. Why is it the least valuable? There's nobody there, right? Remember, in feudal system, land is wealth. It's not wealth because it's land, it's because it's people. If you have land, you got people to work for you. That's where your wealth is. There's nobody in North America. So it's the least valuable. Spain at least had, well, you know, the capital of the Aztec Empire. There's people there.
They all died.
They didn't all die. A lot of people died. But there's people there. In this old feudal system, people is where the wealth is. England looking at the United States, not called the United States, but these American colonies, is all that's left. But if we shift it, and we don't think of it simply as accessing the land, if we think of it as ports, then suddenly the American colonies become much, much more valuable. Now the problem is that the American colonies were exporting lots of people. I mean, we're talking millions of people over the course of about 100 years. And so when England began to treat the colonies differently, not like they did here, but starting to treat them like mercantiles. All we want you guys to do is give us the raw materials and then buy from us. And don't you dare sell your stuff to France or to Spain or anybody else. You have to sell it back to us. And we're going to tax you in the process. The Americans got to be very upset, and we had a revolution, and they lost it completely. And from that, England learned. And the first learning, what was the first lesson? try to think in my, read my mind, but give me a guess of what the first lesson they would get from the American Revolution.
So representation in the colonies.
Yes, yes, but you only need representation in the colonies if you have English there. What would be a way of kind of evading that? I mean, they treat this with Canada. That's the first thing they do with Canada, is they give Canada, because there's already people there.
Establish laws.
Yeah, what are you thinking, Jason?
All you need is just a port there.
You don't do this anymore. Focus on the port. In a perfect world, you won't have anything more than the port. And then they won't be upset about it. They're trading. You're giving them goodies, right? You're giving them finished products that they don't have. And they're giving you raw materials cheap. That's all you need. You don't have to have the land. You don't have to export people there. You don't have to try to encourage settlers out there, because that's an old way of looking at your empire. You just need the ports. But that doesn't avoid the problem. It just kind of pushes it one step further. And what we're going to see, and we're going to talk about this when we talk about India, but basically India was mainly ports. That's all it was. But English influence begins to expand because these ports become very valuable, especially after 1800, when we no longer have the Americas. Where are the English going to get their cotton from? Getting it from India, right? So they want cotton to be, India to be making lots of cotton, some tobacco, all sorts of these products that we used to be getting from the Americas. So we need their raw materials. We bring them back to England and we turn them into things. But we use them as raw materials. Well, if they become so valuable, and if the chaos that really is the politics of India increases, then you begin to threaten the ports. So the solution is to restore order. And by restoring order, your ports are protected. And how do you restore order? You have government control. It's not your first preference. We don't want to do that, but sometimes we have to do that. This make sense? Let me give you an example. India we're going to talk about on Monday, but let's go back and talk about